Hello, I'm Jean Meserve, back again. We're going to continue our conversation about disinformation, its impact on democracy, and what in the world we do about it. Specifically, how can we stop this flow of insidious and destructive fake and false information that's undermining democracy while protecting the free flow of information that can help democracy grow and prosper. We have a great panel here to discuss this. With us, Representative Jason Crow, a Democratic member of Congress from the state of Colorado, Jan Neutze, who is Senior Director of the Defending Democracy Program at Microsoft, and also Adrian Shahbaz, Director of Technology and Democracy at Freedom House. Thank you all for being with us today. Congressman, I'd like to start with you because you were there, of course, on January 6th, in the thick of it, in a situation that was fomented online with calls of a stolen election. I'd like to get from your bird's eye view some perspective on how serious a threat you think disinformation is to democracy.
Yeah, thanks, Jean, for having me on. Thanks for the Democracy Summit and to the Corbell School for putting this together. It's a very important topic. And obviously it's on everyone's mind post January 6th, as we saw a riot, a mob conduct an insurrection against the US Capitol to try to derail democracy and the certification of the election process. And I've given a lot of thought to how we got to that point and how we get out of it. And one of the things that I realized on that day and the days after, as I reflected on the attack, and I was one of those members of Congress who was actually trapped in the House chamber in the gallery for close to a half an hour as we were surrounded by a mob that was trying to break the doors down until we were rescued. And one of the things that I realized was, these folks actually believed this. They believed these lies and this information in a very deep way. In their hearts, they believed that the election had been stolen. They believed in these conspiracy theories. And that didn't happen overnight. It didn't happen just because of one speech. It happened because the groundwork had been laid over a period of time. Obviously there was a perfect storm of technology at play. But what was very different about this scenario is that we had technology, we had a pandemic, we had these societal and economic forces that have come to bear over a period of decades. But what differentiated this instance is you had people at the highest level of power in the United States government. You had people at the White House, the President of the United States, furthering these lies, invalidating them. And that's what was really different about this situation.
And so do you think this disinformation that was flowing so heavily from so many different quarters, did it pose a threat to democracy? And is it a national security threat, in your opinion?
Yes, it is a national security threat. We see growing extremism. White supremacy, anti-government groups, anti-government militias, all of these things are on the rise. They're on the rise because they've been politicized. You have validators, again, in official government positions that legitimize it, that mainstream it. And then you have technology that allows people to come together to find each other online. These folks that used to be kind of disparate, that were on their own, lone wolves and others, are now finding each other in ways that they didn't before. And then they're reaffirming these extremist beliefs and having it reaffirmed not just by algorithms of technology, but by each other in these support networks. So it is a national security threat. We have an extremist problem in the military. I'm a member of the Armed Services Committee. You have people in positions of public trust in our military and law enforcement who have become a part of and pulled into these extremist movements. And we have to address it because it's not going to go away.
Jan, despite all the talk of a rigged and stolen election, officials here in the U.S. at the federal, state, and local level all said there was no indication of interference with actual election systems. I'm wondering if, from your perspective, as someone in the technology field, if the principal threat to democracy now is less from that sort of meddling and more from the disinformation space.
Thanks so much, Jean. Let me just say briefly thank you to you and to the organizers for having me on this panel, this important discussion. And before I answer your question, I'd also like to thank Representative Crow in particular for his service to the country and for his valor on that day, on January 6th, and for talking so ably and so thoughtfully about the lessons that we need to learn from that day and the disinformation campaign that led up to that day. Now, as for your question, I would say, unfortunately, it is both. I think we do need to continue to worry about challenges facing and threats, be they foreign or domestic, to the integrity of our elections. Although I would agree, from our perspective, there was no indication whatsoever that the electoral process was tampered with in the November elections. But it very much also is the threat of disinformation, as we're discussing here. And when we talk about disinformation, I think it's really important to recognize that for many years, there was a lot of emphasis and focus on the challenges posed by foreign actors in this space. And there's a lot of academic work that has gone into tracking how this has evolved. And it's very important, and that is continuing. But it also is clear that domestic actors are becoming much more active and have been active in propagating dis and misinformation, both as it relates to elections, but we've also seen some of this as it relates to, for example, mis and disinformation about the COVID-19 pandemic. And so I think we need to make sure that we widen the aperture and that we tackle threats that emanate both from foreign sources as well as domestic actors. And we think technology companies have a significant responsibility to help with that.
And we will talk about that in just a moment. But Adrian, I wanna get to you for just a moment, because I think January 6th is so fresh in our memory. We're thinking about social media as a fire hose of disinformation that is disrupting democracy. But remind us also, please, that it can be a positive force when it comes to democratic movements.
Of course. Thank you so much, Jean. I just wanted to echo the gratitude to the organizers and to my fellow panelists here. Big fan of their work. So Freedom on the Net is Freedom House's global study of internet freedom. As part of that, we have seen countless examples of digital tools being used in places, particularly where traditional media is heavily censored and monitored by the government. I think the historical event in most people's minds is around the Arab Spring, which of course, in certain countries, I'm thinking particularly in Egypt, Syria, and Libya, that ended up with a lot of violence, the rising hate speech. And I think that in many ways, those countries are worse off today than they were before. However, I think it's important to point to examples like Tunisia, Sudan, even what's happening today in Belarus and what has happened in the past in Armenia, where there were heavily controlled, or perhaps not Armenia, but in the other examples, these are heavily controlled environments, dictatorships, where the government has a stranglehold around sources of information and the ability of individuals to organize, to document what the government is doing and to hold them accountable. And in those cases and many more, we're seeing the use of social media, encrypted messaging apps, and other websites that are out there in order to actually improve democracy, to fight for dignity, social justice, and greater freedom. So it is important to remember the flip side of this. And I think that in some ways, particularly after very stark events of January 6th, we must not swing too far on the pendulum in terms of then having a crackdown on some of these tools that are incredibly important for activists and journalists, not only in some of these closed environments, but also in robust democracies.
I want to remind our audience, we do want your questions. There is an online form underneath the live stream. Use that to submit yours. We do have one, and Jan, I want to throw this in your direction. This is from Anushka Bose, a student at the Korbel School, who asks, is there a difference between disinformation, misinformation, and fake news? Do our definitions matter when it comes to the lens through which we see the problem? Jan, can you take that?
Sure, happy to. What I'd say is, from the get-go, I'm not a huge fan of the term fake news, just because I think it doesn't.
And neither am I as a journalist. I'm not a fan either.
It's too easy to sort of use as a throwaway term. I think some people use the term junk news, which I think captures things a little bit better. The difference between dis and misinformation, at least when you look at a lot of the academic work on this topic, tends to be the question of intent. misinformation can be information that's put out there without necessarily the intent to deceive, whereas disinformation very much is focused on trying to cause distortions, cause fear, and change perceptions people hold individually and collectively. And so I think that in the fact, though, that maybe there aren't these universally agreed definitions is actually part of the problem as we are thinking about how to prescribe solutions, both on the technology side as well as on the policy side.
Congressman, you mentioned President Trump. He, of course, has been deplatformed by a couple anyway, and so have some others. I'm wondering if you have seen a reduction in the flow of disinformation as a result of that. Has it been effective or not?
Yeah, Gene, I have seen a reduction in the flow of that, but I want to make it really clear that from my perspective, these deplatformings are not long-term solutions. Right? Because long-term, I think they will actually exacerbate the problem. These companies made the decision to deplatform folks based on a very specific violent extremist threat, a terrorist threat that we were looking at over the last couple of months and post-January 6th. But long-term, doing that actually feeds into a lot of these conspiracy theories. If we drive people further down into obscure platforms, it will increase the echo chambers. It will increase our divisiveness as a society, the tribalism that has gripped our politics and our civic society overall. So what we actually need to do, and I think this is a legislative issue, and it's Congress's responsibility to pick the ball up here and to actually create some rules of the road, because companies should not be in the position of having to make these ad hoc decisions behind closed doors without transparency. There needs to be transparency and rules of the road that say these platforms are important for freedom of speech. They're important for civic discourse. They're the modern equivalent of the town hall or the town square. And it's important that we protect speech. But at the same time, it's also important that we not allow threats, terrorism, incitement, and violence to be spread as well. So we have to find a way to do that. It's not going to be easy, but Congress has to do it in consultation with the FCC and other regulators.
We have another viewer question from Gabriel Truby of Denver, who says, how can disinformation be moderated in an unbiased manner? Something you just mentioned. Jan and Adrian, I'd love to get your input on this. Who determines what's true and what isn't? Should it be the platforms, Jan?
I think it's a really important question, first of all. And also, I think it's clear from what we've seen over the last few months and years that there are no easy answers. Some countries have adopted legislation. When I look at some of the trends in Europe, for example, others are thinking about legislation. And I think having legislation in this space makes a lot of sense and is very important. But there are other things in addition that can be done. I will point to one solution that we find hugely helpful, and that is a group called Newsguard that we have partnered with. Newsguard provides a service run by journalists and former journalists that rates online news websites based on 9 journalistic integrity principles, and then comes up with both a nutrition label as well as a red or green rating that gives the user that consumes news articles from this from this online news source transparency and context about what they are consuming. And so they're not about censorship. They are about transparency and context, so that you know that you are consuming news at the source level, not the article level, at the source level from a news website that is trustworthy and has integrity. So that is an example of what can be done in terms of civil society, really, and private sector solutions that can augment the role of regulation, the role of governments, which undoubtedly I think we need to see more of.
Adrian, I wanted your thoughts on who should be the arbiter of truth. Certainly, you've seen some authoritarians using this as an opportunity to control social media in a way that we would perceive to be anti-democratic.
Yeah, certainly. So I wanted to just touch on this definition of the word disinformation. And Jan said something, not liking the term fake news, which I totally agree with. And I think that I might even extend that to the term disinformation, simply because it's a term that gets thrown around to mean a lot of different things. It really first came to prominence around the 2016 election. It has long been associated with Russian information or influence operations. And now, as the Congressman mentioned, this is being extended to domestic actors who are highly engaged in this. There's been times where we have used the term disinformation in the media and even in DC to mean things like incitement to violence, hate speech, information that lacks context, harassment against certain users. It could even mean, get wrapped up with certain commercial marketing campaigns or, the actions of PR firms. And I think that the point I'm trying to make is that if we are able to define the term and break it into its subcomponents, I think that each component requires a different response. And so on this question of, who is defining disinformation, I think already that term is a bit problematic. And that's what we've seen. Many European governments have difficulties in terms of actually regulating that term. And there have been ways that courts have weighed in to say that that definition is overly broad. It reminds me a lot of the talk around terrorism and that being an overly broad term that then led to a lot of overreach. I think instead, we can be very firm on things like incitement to violence. There's no place for incitement to violence in a democratic society. That is one of the few forms of speech where counter speech is not effective. The impact of it is already felt before people have the ability to respond. Similarly, I think then the hierarchy changes as you move away from government responses, which I think should be very light in accordance to the First Amendment, to then tech company responses. And that's where I think they can be a little bit more broad, opening that up towards certain types of speech that is seen as harassment or hateful towards certain groups, or like in support of certain conspiracy theories like the platforms did around QAnon, for example, more recently. So I think that there's ways that so long as platforms are defining in very clear terms what content is not allowed on their platforms, then we're in good shape. At the same time, there have to be rules, and I think this is somewhere where Congress can also play a role in establishing what are the ways that that we can regulate the conduct of these platforms. They're so big, they're not very transparent. There was, in fact, just a report that came out yesterday called Ranking Digital Rights, which has a transparency rating of all of these companies. They all get a failing grade. And I think that what we need, and what I would love to see more experiments are, is regulation that can mandate certain levels of transparency. One thing that has been introduced in Congress is the Honest Ads Act, which has bipartisan support. This would force companies to maintain a ad library of political ads. That's something that certain platforms like Facebook already do voluntarily, but just mandating it and updating our election laws so that whenever possible, these decisions are actually in the hands of our government, where we do have democratic oversight, rather than in the hands of platforms.
Congressman, I'd like to come back to you on this issue of regulation. A lot of people say the real problem area is the algorithms. That is what's driving people deeper and deeper and deeper into their respective political corners. How would legislation potentially deal with the question of algorithms and transparency in that aspect of the social media world?
I do think regulation, as I mentioned before, Jean, is a part of what we need to do here, right? We can't ignore the fact that there isn't transparency, that people are being fed information that they're not aware of, that's influencing their behavior and obviously our body politic as well. So there needs to be oversight, and I think we need to look at extremism and driving people into these echo chambers. But I don't want to overemphasize regulation, because that's not going to solve all of this. I think it will increase transparency, and I think there is value to it. But digital literacy is also really important. I think we have to look at this from the consumer perspective. I mean, I'm not a digital native. I remember life before the smartphone, before all of these social media platforms. I remember growing up and being taught how to go into the library, to go to the library index cards and to conduct research and to actually discriminate the information and look at the sources of information. We used to teach people how to do this. Then we stopped doing it. And people just kind of do it on their own, but they're not doing it well. And one example that I will use, I went to the beach a couple of years ago with my kids. And when I was at the beach, a shark video popped up on my Facebook feed. Because my phone knew that I was at the beach, and shark videos work well with people that are at the beach. So I clicked on the shark video, and for the rest of that trip, all I saw were video clips of sharks under surfers, sharks swimming around. I didn't want to go into the water because I thought there were sharks everywhere. But I knew enough that I was being the victim of an algorithm here, that I was being fed information that was disproportionate to the reality that I was in, and I was able to discriminate that. We have to teach people how to be better consumers of this information.
I don't disagree with that, and I want to talk about that. But first, Jan, I want to ping you on this question of regulation and whether in a system, a social media ecosystem, which knows no international borders, and where you could have conflicting regulation in different parts of the world, if that really is a significant part of the solution or not.
So from our perspective, I think we have been on record many times saying that absolutely we do think regulation has a role to play here. And you're right, it is not always maybe as streamlined across just even talking about the world's democracies as one might like it, but I don't think that is a reason to not pursue it. And so when we look at some of the really leading work in this space that is happening currently, looking at some of the things coming out of the European Commission in Brussels, the code of practice on disinformation, which started as a voluntary tool, but I think has been is both a very helpful one in terms of working with companies to highlight and make it clear what they are doing to address mis and disinformation, both generally and in particular also in the last year as it relates to COVID. There are developments in other places around the world that are driven by governments that are thinking about some innovative and smart solutions. So I think there are examples that one can point to and learn from. But I, again, also want to pick up a point the Congressman just made, and that is all of us can actually be a part of the solution and don't necessarily need to wait for this regulation to kick in. Media literacy or media competency, as Minister Tang called it, is a great example. There's so much that we can do, whether it's tech companies investing in media literacy, whether it is governments trying to foster media literacy in schools and colleges. That really can help strengthen societal resilience. That makes it much harder for disinformation to resonate and have the impact that it currently has. So I think it's really a systematic approach, has all these different components that we need to take into account.
We actually have a couple of questions coming in from the audience that go back to Minister Stang and what was said about what's happening in Taiwan. Audrey Chang talked about this important of education, essentially vaccinating the mind against its disinformation. It seemed to me, though, to be a very long-term sort of proposition. Maybe not in a Taiwan, but in a larger country like the United States. It seems to me that we need action now, and that takes too long. Adrian, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I really appreciated Minister Tang's speech. There are a lot of things that I think that we have to learn in terms of some of the long-term solutions, as you mentioned. One thing that wasn't mentioned was Taiwan's Anti-Infiltration Act. So this is a law that Taiwan passed ahead of its more recent election. And this was a very controversial bill that actually led to the resignation of one of the heads of the National Communication Commission. And I think that shows the reality that whether these forms of regulation are passed in Taiwan, which is a very democratic, open society, even in places like in Europe or Australia, and you can imagine what would happen in the United States. These mechanisms are highly vulnerable to capture from the executive and from other forces in society. I think that's why it's extremely challenging to think about what are the best solutions towards pushing back against disinformation. There are ways that national security agencies have been heavily involved in the past few years, particularly, with NATO and the Stratcom, but also, the US boosting its own capacity in this. At the same time, while they perhaps are one of the best actors in terms of tracking, detecting these types of very complex disinformation operations, people also are very wary about national security agencies biasing electoral outcomes. And so if they're intervening, in the lead up to an election to say that there is a campaign that is supporting this politician or this party, that can oftentimes make the situation worse. So, I think that all of this to say, I think there are some very low-hanging fruit. And in the case of Taiwan, just taking a further look around election laws. These are oftentimes passed many, many decades ago, at times before social media and before the internet. I think that a first step would be regulating political ad spends, and also, within the field of campaign finance reform, for example. I think that we could also look into regulating the industry itself, because we can't just be focusing on the symptoms of, these bot networks popping up here and there. We have to tackle the source of the problem, and it's the actors that are paying for this, but also the purveyors of disinformation. And I think Cambridge Analytica was only the tip of the iceberg. They are, as far as I am aware, no longer in existence, but there is this entire new industry of professional influencers who are operating not only in democracies, but around the world with little or no oversight around their activities. I think that is an industry that is ripe for greater regulation, because that is really about the conduct of a few companies in shaping our information ecosystem.
Congressman Crow, I'd love your response to that, but I also want to throw at you another audience question. This is coming in from Samuel Feldman at the University of Denver. Can you please share how disinformation can be addressed in society when members of Congress are pushing it themselves? How dangerous is that for legislative debate?
Yeah, that's a great question by Samuel. But I first do want to address the issue of disinformation and misinformation with some of my fellow panelists sit here. One other really important element to this is not just dis and misinformation, but actual good information. And what I'm talking about is the information that these companies have on all of us, right? People think that these platforms are free. They're not free. They come at the cost of your privacy. They come at the cost of the intimate details of your life. Because when you sign up for these things, these companies are building profiles of you. And I think most consumers would be absolutely shocked by the information and the intimate details that these companies are collecting on you and your family. And they're selling it to companies to then target you. And of course, that applies for all of these companies, and it's driving extremism as a consequence of that. So there is a role as to who owns that information. I think that's something that Congress needs to look at, legislators need to look at, is at what point does information become somebody else's, and at what point should you have control over who has it, who has access to it, and their ability to sell it. That's a really important aspect of this conversation. And on the disinformation, this is the point that I made at the outset, is what's different. Conspiracy theories are not new. They're as old as mankind itself. What happens is we go through these periods where there are major technological advances that outpace the societal checks that exist, our civic checks on these. And then sometimes it catches up. But what's very different about this one, because we have this innovation that has outpaced our societal ability to check it and to correct it, is the validators that we have at the highest level of government. And that's extremely troubling and extremely dangerous. And it's why I push back on it, because we can't allow that to be normalized. We can't allow that to be acceptable behavior in our political discourse. A democracy cannot survive that. So I think it's important people push back and that leaders see and hear people preferably people from the own party of those who are sowing these conspiracy theories, that they continue to push back on it.
We're almost out of time. I want to quickly jump through a couple questions here and get some answers on the record before we have to wrap up. Jan, for you, technology, can it solve this problem for us? Can artificial intelligence be better employed to clamp down on disinformation? Jan, I think you're on mute.
I was on mute, of course. Great question. I want to say technology can help. I don't think technology is by itself is the panacea. Let me give you one example. One of the what's often called sort of an emerging threat in disinformation is the threat of artificial and synthetic media or deep fakes. And deep fakes, what we're seeing really is a cat and mouse game between those who are creating deep fakes and those who are trying to detect it. And so in many ways, the long-term solution is not detection, but media authentication and provenance. There's actually some exciting developments there. Just a couple of days ago, there's a new alliance and industry coalition announced of companies who've come together to try and work on solutions that can provide a long-term foundation for how to actually deal with accurate information, especially in the news media space. And so we're very excited about what that can contribute. But it's a long-term effort, and it's not the only solution out there, which is why I think we've been talking about everything from policy to awareness and resilience, as well as technology.
So again, a quick answer, Congressman, from you. It seems to me if we police the social media platforms, the disinformation is just going to move somewhere else. It's going to go to encrypted apps. People are just going to turn to their particular preferred media outlet. Isn't this bigger than just social media and regulating social media?
Yeah, it is. And that's what brings us back to the digital or media literacy discussion, because you can't legislate your way out of every problem. Legislation has a time and place. It can solve big and important issues, but it doesn't solve everything. The technology moves much faster than the legislative calendar. There's no doubt about that. The pace of innovation now is so fast compared to our ability to discern what's happening and then the legislate solutions, that we have to get to a more fundamental level. We have to start educating folks to be those better consumers. We have to create some other societal checks on what's happening. Otherwise, it will continue to run out of control. And one of those societal checks, I think, is democracy reform, because what's driving some of this is the divisiveness in our politics, and why you're having validators at high levels validating these conspiracy theories is you have things like gerrymandering. So long as we have deep red districts and deep blue districts, and there's no incentive to cross the aisle and talk to one another, you get these echo chambers that will continue to drive extremism. And we have to break that down, and we have to do things like ending the impact of dark money in our politics as well that drives this. So there's a lot of components to it that we have to look at.
And unfortunately, we have to leave it there. Congressman Crow, Adrian Shahbaz, and Jan Neutze, thanks so much for joining us here today for this important conversation, which will be continued in other panels, I'm sure. We're going to take a quick look at what Cal is working on with his cartooning, and then we have a session coming up on democracy and climate change.